May died on a Thursday morning in October, shortly after the first feeding of the day. She had been declining for 2 weeks, a respiratory infection that the veterinary team had treated aggressively and that had not responded the way they needed it to. She was 11 years old, which was not old for a rhesus macaque in managed care, and the decline had been fast enough that the staff had not fully prepared themselves for the speed of the ending. By the time Joe Aldrich arrived at the enclosure at 6:15, May was already gone, and Rue was already beside her. Rue was 4 months old. She had been born in June, a healthy delivery, May's third infant. Joe had documented the birth the way he documented every birth at Hartwell the time. The weight, the initial nursing behavior, the way the rest of the group had responded to the new arrival. He had noted that May was an attentive mother, which was consistent with her history, and that Rue had latched within the first hour, which was a good sign. He had not noted anything that predicted this moment, because nothing predicted this moment. It had simply arrived, the way the worst things do, on an ordinary Thursday while the rest of the facility was going about its morning. Joe stood at the enclosure gate and looked at Rue sitting beside May's body. Rue's hand was resting on May's arm. She was not making sounds. She was not moving. She was simply present, in the absolute, total way that very young animals are present with the things they cannot yet understand. Joe had been working with primates for 19 years. He had seen grief, behavior before, had documented it, had managed it, had made the decisions that the welfare protocols required him to make when an animal was suffering from loss. He knew the standard approach. He had applied it many times. You gave the animal time to process the initial shock. You removed the body within a practical window. You monitored the surviving animal for signs of acute distress, and you began the process of reintegration into the social group. He stood at the gate for a long time. Then he went to find Dr. Patricia Hale. And here is the thing about what Joe decided to do next and what Dr. Hale agreed to that matters before the rest of this story makes sense. It was not a small decision. It was the kind of decision that people in welfare roles spend careers learning to make, and that most of them, if they are being honest, never make more than once or twice in a career, because the standard protocol exists for good reasons, and deviating from it requires more than intuition. The conversation in Dr. Hale's office lasted 40 minutes. Joe presented the situation. Dr. Hale asked the questions that the welfare director's role required her to ask the questions about distress indicators, about hygiene concerns, about the risks of allowing extended contact with a deceased animal, about the precedents and the protocols and the liability considerations that came with deviating from established procedure. Joe answered each question carefully. He had been answering careful questions for 19 years, and he was good at it. Then, Dr. Hale asked him what he thought they should do, and Joe said he thought they should leave Rue where she was. Not indefinitely, not without monitoring, not without a clear threshold for intervention if Rue's physical condition deteriorated beyond what the situation warranted. But he thought they should leave her, and he thought they should put water and food within her reach without requiring her to leave May to get it, and he thought they should watch. Dr. Hale looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" Joe said he did not know. He said he thought Rue would tell them. Dr. Hale was quiet for a longer moment. She was 51 years old and had spent 23 years in primate welfare, and she had not survived that long by making decisions she could not defend. She knew what the standard protocol said. She also knew what Joe Aldrich's 19 years of observation were worth, and she had learned long ago that those two things were sometimes in tension and that the tension required judgment rather than deference. she said, daily welfare checks, full documentation, intervention threshold at any sign of physical deterioration. And she said, keep me informed. Joe went back to the enclosure and placed a shallow dish of water and a small portion of Rue's preferred food within reach of where she sat, close enough that she would not need to move more than a few inches to access either. Then he sat down outside the enclosure on the wooden bench that had been there since before he started working at Hartwell, and he began what would become his daily routine for the next 27 days. The first week was the hardest to watch. Rue did not eat on the first day. She drank a small amount of water on the second day, reaching for the dish without lifting her hand from May's arm, drinking with the distracted, mechanical quality of an animal doing the minimum necessary to continue existing while the rest of its attention was occupied elsewhere. She ate a small amount on the third day. She slept in short intervals, curled against May's body, her breathing monitored by the overnight camera that Joe reviewed each morning before he came in. The staff did not talk about it much in the first week. There was a quality of collective holding breath among the people who worked at Hartwell, a shared, unspoken awareness that something was happening that none of them had the right framework for, and that the appropriate response was a kind of careful attention rather than commentary. The main group, separated from Rue by the mesh partition that divided the enclosure during May's illness, could see Rue from their side. Joe noted in his daily records that several of the older females in the group had begun spending time near the partition, sitting close to the mesh in a way that was not typical behavior for animals that generally preferred the center of the space. He noted it without interpretation, the way he noted everything: date, time, behavior, duration, and left the interpretation for later. In the second week, Rue began to move slightly more. She would shift position, groom May's fur with the slow, methodical attention of an animal performing an action that it understood and that gave it something to do. She began eating more consistently, not with appetite exactly, but with the routine engagement of an animal that had decided, at whatever level animals decide things, to continue participating in the basic requirements of its own survival. Joe watched this and wrote in his daily notes, "She has decided to stay." This is different from being unable to leave. The distinction mattered to him. He had spent 19 years learning to read the difference between an animal trapped by its circumstances and an animal that had made a choice within them. And what he was watching in Rue did not look like the paralysis of an animal overwhelmed by loss. It looked like the deliberate presence of an animal that was doing something specific and intended to finish it. He was not certain this interpretation would satisfy a peer review. He put it in his notes anyway. By the third week, the staff had stopped holding their breath. Not because the situation had resolved, but because they had learned to read its rhythms: the morning welfare check, the placement of food and water, Joe's hours on the bench outside the enclosure, the daily notes that documented Rue's incremental engagement with food and water, and the small variations in her positioning that suggested, if nothing else, that she was present in her own situation rather than absent from it. Dr. Hale visited the enclosure on day 19. She sat on the bench beside Joe for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "How do you know when it's over?" Joe said, "I think she'll know." Doctor. Hale looked at Rue through the mesh. Rue was sitting in her established position, one hand on May, her face oriented toward the partition where two of the older females were sitting on the other side of the wire. She had been doing this more in the last several days, spending time facing the partition rather than facing away from it. Joe had noted it. He had not said anything to Dr. Freed, Hale, about it because he was not yet certain it meant what he thought it might mean. After Hale left, Joe sat on the bench a while longer. He thought about the 19 years and the animals he had worked with and the things he had learned that could not be put into welfare protocols because they were not the kind of knowledge that fit into that form. He thought about May, who had been at Hartwell for 9 years and who he had known well enough to recognize by the sound of her movement before he saw her. He thought about what it meant to know an animal well enough to recognize it in the dark, and what it meant to lose one. He wrote in his daily notes, day 19. No change in condition. Rue continues to face the partition in the afternoon hours. I think she is getting ready. On the morning of day 28, Joe arrived at 6:15 as he always did. The enclosure was quiet. The overnight camera had recorded nothing unusual. Joe checked the food and water Rue had eaten during the night, more than her typical intake for the past week. He noted this. He moved to his position outside the enclosure and looked through the mesh. Rue was standing, not sitting. Not in the position she had held for 27 days, with one hand on May and her weight settled into the particular low, patient configuration that Joe had come to think of as her grief posture. She was standing upright, her weight distributed evenly, her face oriented toward the gate that connected the quarantine section to the main group enclosure. Joe did not move. Rue looked at the gate. She looked at it with the focused, evaluative attention of an animal that has made a decision and is verifying the logistics. Then she walked to it. She was 4 months old, and she had spent the last 27 days in one position, and her legs were not entirely steady. And she walked to the gate the way you walk when you are doing something that matters more than whether your legs are entirely steady. She reached the gate and she knocked on it, not scratched, not pushed, knocked, with the back of her knuckles, the way you knock on a door when you want it to open. Joe stood outside the enclosure and did not move and did not breathe, and thought, for perhaps 3 seconds, that he had been working with primates for 19 years and he had never seen this before. Then he went to open the gate. The main group was already oriented toward the sound. The 2 older females who had been spending time near the partition were closest. When the gate opened, Rue walked through it. She did not look back. Not at May. Not at the enclosure she had lived in for the past 27 days. Not at Joe, who was standing at the gate with his hands still on the latch. She walked through the gate, and the older female closest to her reached out and touched her, and Rue allowed it. And then they were both moving toward the center of the main group space where the rest of the animals were. And the gate was open behind her, and there was nothing on the other side of it that she was looking at. Joe stood at the gate for a while. He looked at May's body, which was still where it had been for 28 days, and which would need to be attended to now, and which he found himself unable to approach immediately. He went to the bench. He sat down. He opened his notebook. He wrote the date and the time. He wrote, Rue entered the main group this morning. Self-initiated. Knocked on the gate. Did not look back. He paused. Then he wrote, in 19 years I have made decisions about when animals were ready to move forward. I have read behavioral indicators and consulted protocols and applied professional judgment. I have never watched an animal decide for itself when its grief was finished and then get up and act on that decision. He closed the notebook. He looked through the mesh at the main group enclosure, where Rue was moving through the space with the careful attention of an animal learning new terrain. And the older female was beside her, and the rest of the group was doing the thing that groups do when a new member is finding its place, watching, adjusting, accommodating in the small ways that social animals accommodate new configurations. He thought she knew. She was doing something in there for 27 days that looked like waiting but was not waiting. It was more like finishing. And when she was finished, she stood up and knocked on the door. He did not write that in the notebook. Some things you think and do not write, because writing them makes them into a claim that requires defense. And he did not want to defend it. He just wanted to know it. 3 years later, On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Joe stood at the observation window of the main group enclosure and watched the animal that had been Rue. She was not Rue anymore. In any practical sense, she was the dominant female of a group of 13. The animal whose position in the social hierarchy was the highest available to a female in that configuration. The one whose behavioral signals the rest of the group calibrated against when they were uncertain about the correct response to a new situation. She had gotten there the way alpha females typically get there, through a combination of social intelligence and consistent behavior, and the particular quality of presence that other animals in a group recognize and organize themselves around. Joe had documented the process across 3 years of weekly observations. He had watched her build her coalition and manage her relationships, and navigate the specific challenges that came with ascending in a group where the existing hierarchy had been stable. There was one afternoon in the second year that he had written about in more detail than the others. A younger female had been challenging Rue's position, the kind of sustained, low-level pressure that eventually forces a resolution one way or the other. Joe had watched Rue handle it the way experienced dominant females handle it. Not through direct confrontation, but through the patient, consistent assertion of presence that made the challenge gradually less worth sustaining. The younger female had backed down over the course of 3 weeks. Rue had not changed her behavior during those 3 weeks by any measurable degree. She had simply continued being exactly what she was, in the same way, until the question stopped being asked. Joe had written in his notes, "She is very good at waiting. She always has been." He had watched it the way he watched everything: date, time, behavior, duration. But he had also watched it the way you watch something that you were present at the beginning of, in a way that most people were not. He had been on the bench outside the quarantine enclosure for 27 days. He had placed the food and water within reach. He had not opened the gate until she knocked on it. He thought about that sometimes, when he was watching her move through the group with the unhurried authority of an animal that had decided it belonged somewhere and was no longer interested in anyone else's opinion on the matter. He thought about the Thursday morning when May died, and the 4-month-old infant that sat down beside her and did not get up for almost a month. He thought she finished something in there. Whatever it was, she finished it. And then she stood up. That was enough. That had always been enough. Joe Aldrich closed his notebook, put his pen in his pocket, and went to start the afternoon feeding.